My name is Stuart Umpleby. I'm an instructor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in the Department of Management Science. So that whereas Umberto was talking about the biology of cognition, I'll be talking about the social environment. And I'll be relying a good deal upon a shared perception amongst me and this group about how that interaction between human beings and social environments takes place. I hope that I won't trip myself up and make any references to an objective reality. The title of my talk is Self-Authorization, a characteristic of some elements in certain self-organizing systems. Really what this talk is an illustration of how the principle of self-organization can be used to design social systems. So first, let me start off by explaining what I mean by self-authorization. I came to an interest in this idea as a result of spending 3 years as the president of a small academic organization called the American Society for Cybernetics. And while I was doing that work, I found that I was often inviting people to take part in conferences, inviting people to submit articles to journals, and in a sense authorizing people to do things on behalf of the society. Well, being a basically lazy person, I decided that it'd be very nice if people would just authorize themselves, and that would mean less work for me. And realizing, of course, that it's easier to change the world than to change oneself, I set out to devise a strategy for changing the world so that I wouldn't have to work so hard. Now, I was once reading Newsweek magazine, and they were reporting on a young fellow who had been moved by John Kennedy's statement to ask not what you can do for your country, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So he joined the Peace Corps and went out and worked in a developing country and came back, settled down, started a family, and didn't do much of anything else in a socially conscious vein. He said, nobody asked me to do anything else, so I didn't. And I read that and I thought, well, why not ask yourself? So I thought maybe there's something to this notion of self-authorization. And as I talked to my students at the university, I came to the conclusion that they didn't come with this notion firmly lodged in their minds. They seemed to be primarily interested in finding a comfortable niche in the existing social order as opposed to transforming the social order in a direction that they thought would be more beneficial. So, being a cybernetician, I set to work with my cybernetic principles to figure out how to go about an appropriate design. And of course, the notion of self-organization is really quite fundamental in the way that cyberneticians think about the world. So let me give you a little bit of a history of the concept of self-organization. The idea was originally formulated by a group of people who were interested in learning. That is, they were trying to make a machine that would learn. And in order to do that, it's useful to have a machine that organizes itself such that its performance improves over time with respect to a particular task. So, if this is the machine or the organism, then the original concept of a self-organizing system was that that thing was the self-organizing system, that is the organism. Well, Heinz von Forster, who's attending this conference, noted that this doesn't really happen. Or if it did happen, you really couldn't distinguish hallucinations from learning, that there has to be an environment out there. And the organism interacts with the environment. So he wrote an article called Self-Organizing Systems and Their Environments, continuing with the assumption that the organism was a self-organizing system. Then Ross Ashby, at almost the same time, wrote an article called Principles of the Self-Organizing System. And he made an assumption which was different from the assumption that had been made previously, which was that this whole thing was the self-organizing system. So that he described the principle of self-organization as follows. Any isolated determinate dynamic system, obeying unchanging laws, will develop organisms that are adapted to their environments. That's the short form. There's a longer form that sort of brings it home. Imagine a system. This system can be in a number of different states. Happiness, sadness, war, peace, whatever you want to call a state. Some of the states are equilibrial states. Some of them are non-equilibrial states. In the normal course of events, the system will tend to go towards its stable equilibrial states. And as it does, it stays there. If it's in a non-equilibrial state, it has a tendency to move. So that over time, the system will occupy the stable equilibrial states. As it does so, it selects, thereby organizing itself. Previously, the notion had been that there was some sort of a contradiction between the tendency of a system to go towards stable equilibrium and the tendency of a system to become more organized. They were thought of as being somehow opposite. What Ashby showed was that these are different sides of the same coin. They are different interpretations given by observers when describing a particular phenomenon. So the significance, theoretically, of the concept of self-organization is that it resolves the apparent oppositeness or contradiction between the second law of thermodynamics, the tendency towards entropy or unavailable energy, and the rise of order or the emergence of organization. Another nice thing about the principle of self-organization is that it is a very general concept, and scientists are, of course, always looking for very general concepts. It just makes their life easier. It means you can get more mileage out of a few ideas. The principle of self-organization can be thought of as a more general version of Darwin's theory of natural selection, of learning theory, or of theories of political and economic development. The principle is also of great practical significance because it gives you a general design rule. And the design rule is that if you want to manipulate any object or organism, you expose it to an environment such that the interaction rules between the organism and the environment move the organism in the direction you want it to go. Now, people use this idea all the time. They just don't call it that. That's the nice thing about science, is that it doesn't contradict any of your preconceptions as long as your preconceptions are pretty clever. For example, if you're a chemist and you want to, say, smelt some iron, you put the iron in a blast furnace along with some coke and oxygen and so forth, and the natural interaction rules of the system produce steel. You have to know those interaction rules in order to design the blast furnace, but it works. If you want to educate a child, at least the way we currently go about it, you stick the child in a school such that the interaction rules between the child and the school move the child in the direction you want it to go. That is, it learns how to read and write. And if you're concerned with the rambunctious behavior of major corporations, then you design a social environment through antitrust action, environmental protection agencies, and so forth, such that the interaction between the corporations and the government agencies causes the corporations to behave in the way that you would like them to behave. So we have a general design rule now based on the principle of self-organization for designing or manipulating the social systems that we want to deal with. Let me just make one quick distinction. The self-organizing system is the total social system that consists of the human beings or the elements, the corporations, or whatever. Self-authorization refers to the behavior of one of these elements. So what we're really trying to do is to build a model inside our human beings such that they will be capable of self-authorizing behavior. Now, not being a psychologist, I'll say some things which some people may contradict, but it's my understanding that psychologists have sort of tended to avoid the notion of mental models in the past with their interest in behavior. I guess out of an interest in avoiding introspectionism, they concentrated on what was overtly observable, and so the behaviorists concentrated on what was going on outside the organism as opposed to what was going on inside. But the people who were working on artificial intelligence, that is, making machines do things that make them appear to be intelligent, have found that it is essential to construct models inside the machines, and they have to tell the machine if this happens and that happens, and if A happens and B happens, and so on. So they talk in terms of models and components of models inside these supposedly cognitive critters. So what are the components that would be useful for a system to be self-organizing, self-authorizing? Well, first of all, it would be useful to have a representation of the social system that you're trying to deal with. That is, what is the current state of the social system? Your internal representation of the current state of that social system. Also, you would want to have a representation of the desired state of that system. Then, as a third component, you would want to know how these kinds of things change over time. How they change sort of on the basis of their own interactions, and how they can be brought about to change by some sort of intervention. Then our self-authorizing person would need to have a model of itself. That is, it has to have an internal representation of what it is. And that internal representation would have at least three components, subcomponents, it seems to me. The first one would be, it would have to have a representation of its capabilities. Like, what is it good at and what is it not so good at? And then it would have to have a representation of the desired capabilities. Like, if it wants to be able to do calculus and it can't currently do calculus, then it needs to go out and learn calculus. And the third component would be, it needs to know how to get from the desired to the existing capabilities. Okay. So that its model of itself are the current capabilities, desired capabilities, and how to transform the desired into the current. And the fifth element, seems to me, is that our self-authorizing person needs to know how it interacts with the social system that it's trying to change. If it does something, how will the social system respond? If the social system does something, how will that affect the self-authorizing person's interests? And then the last component is, it might be useful to have a sort of long-term plan. That is, people have limited lifespans. They're only around for so long, so that if you only have 5 years to live, you might not want to spend your time in a 5-year PhD program, because by the time you finish, you don't have too much time left. So a kind of overall lifespan might be useful. Okay, so if that is the model that we want to somehow implant within our self-authorizing person, the next question is, how do we get it there? And of course, being an educator, I think in terms of curricula. So let me just go through that very quickly, and then I'll say some mildly theoretical points. You can list the elements of the components of your model, and then list the kinds of things you want to have in your curriculum. That usually gets into things like a knowledge of other cultures, philosophy and ethics, an understanding of history, an understanding of personal psychology, some experience in dealing with social systems, and also a sense of biographies. Now, there are two ways that you can try to get those ideas implanted in the minds of individuals. Either you can teach them, or you can expose them to environments such that as they go about pursuing their own vested interests, they will tend to acquire these ideas. And it's that second approach that I think is more compatible with the approach that Umberto has presented. Okay, so let me just summarize then what I've said. Using our notion of a self-organizing system, what we've done is that we've said, take the organism as a student and the environment as a university curriculum. You design the university curriculum such that the student is exposed to experiences which create within the mind of the student the kinds of components that are necessary in order for the person to become self-authorizing. That doesn't guarantee that the person's going to do that, because that takes a fair amount of insight into how to put all that together, but at least you have a start on it. Then the second application of self-organization is that if you now have a self-authorizing individual, whenever that individual finds itself in a social environment, whether it be a family, a corporation, or the larger social system, that element should be able to look at the interaction rules going on within the self-organizing system, conceive of an alternative set of interaction rules, and then interact itself with the social environment so that the interaction rules within the social environment go from the current state to the desired state.